Hey guys, welcome to the start of another beginner's tutorial type series, this time on cabinet refinishing. Now I'm talking about the classic radio and TV cabinets of the 30s, 40s, 50s with a lacquer finish. My goal is to reproduce that as best I can using very similar, if not exactly the same materials that they used back then. I know there's a lot of newer products on the market, but I'm trying to use the traditional type products. I'm talking about a cabinet like this Crosley right next to me, which I recently finished. Now, I don't mean to encourage or condone the wholesale stripping and refinishing of cabinets. Very often they can be refreshed, revived, restored, retained as original as possible. They're only original once. For example, on this, the front of this is still the original finish, just touched up a little bit, but the rest of it was too far gone. Now in this video we're going to be doing a Motorola 9VT1. It's a small mahogany cabinet that was already partially stripped and in really rough shape, so it's definitely a great candidate for refinishing. Let's get started. I've talked about all the techniques I'm going to show in various projects over the years, but I guess looking back on it, I've never done a dedicated start to finish series just on the cabinet. So I pulled out this guy. I picked this guy up I think last year. It's a Motorola 9VT1. It's one of three 8-inch electrostatic TVs they made. There's a Bakelite tabletop, there's a Tolex covered portable, and this is the wood version. And I wanted to get one for a long time. I finally did, but the cabinet is absolutely miserable, and as soon as I got it I wanted to dive in it and refinish it. So that's what we're going to do. It's also modest, it's small, so it's very manageable because we're going to be using techniques and products that I consider practical. If I was doing, or if you're going to be doing this as a full-time or part-time gig, you might want to get more professional equipment than what I'm going to show, like a spring rig in particular. I'm going to be using all off-the-shelf, easy-to-get products, either at your hardware store or inexpensive mail-order items. So let's start at the beginning. Let's talk about the goal. The goal is to get a finish that looks as close to the original as is practical, using the same types of products that were used back then. Yes, I am well aware there are a whole host of newer products on the market, especially over the last 10 years. Water-based, polyacrylic, polyurethane, white-bond poly, water-based lacquer. I'm not using any of that. So I appreciate your suggestions, your advice. I've tried them, I use them. They all work fine. If you want to use them, go ahead. My goal is to do it as close as I can to the way they did it back then, using traditional products and techniques. And that means lacquer. That's what these had. In particular, toned lacquer to get color in the finish. Sometimes they've used stained wood. Now, how do I know how they did it back then? Well, I don't. I wasn't there. This is based on the experience of many guys who have gone before me and are still around and have shared their knowledge. Some videos that are out from the period showing cabinets being made, and some is just practical advice from woodworkers. You know, they know they know today what products were being made back then, and some of them are still being made, like shellac, for example. It's been around for centuries. Lacquer's been around for a very long time. So we want to reproduce that, and it's not that tough to do. That's another reason I'm doing it. It's not impossible by any means. I think you could all manage it. But let me preface this by saying, yes, there are some fumes, and yes, according to some states, California in particular, they are not a big fan of lacquer and lacquer thinners and petroleum distillate products and so on. Stuff still is being made, it's still being sold if you use practical considerations like good ventilation, wear some gloves. I think you'll be fine. I've been doing this for a long time. I have no ill effects. So. Alright, let's move on. Let's now talk about what is this made out of, what is under the finish, because that has a direct impact on the products we choose to put on top of it. Well, it's a combination of solid woods and veneer. On the front we have a solid, what they call a secondary wood, meaning it's not some fancy exotic stuff. It's just functional, which is very likely poplar because it's stable, it's inexpensive, it's strong, it's easy to work with. It doesn't look like this. It's kind of white greenish naturally. That's where the toner lacquer comes in. When you spray it on, it makes everything the same color. So you look at this, the sides, look at the front, where the original finish is still in good shape. It's the same color. That's what toner lacquer does for you. It's like spray paint, but it's translucent, so you still see the nice grain through it. But it makes it uniform looking. Much better than wipe on stain. Now, on the main body, and on most cabinets, they're veneer. Veneer is they take a really nice exotic hardwood tree and they put it like in a giant pencil sharpener. And this is the shavings off of it. Typically like a 32nd of an inch thick, or maybe a 16th. The older veneer tends to be a bit thicker than the stuff you can buy now. And this is what they call quarter cut. Quarter cut is where you have thin stripes. Face cut is where it's big figures, and that just is a matter of how they put the tree on the slicing machine and cut it up. But quarter cut is what you're typically going to see. And this isn't one piece of veneer. Typically they're 4 to 6 inch wide strips that they glue down. And if it's fancy stuff, like if it came out of a burl or a crotch of a tree where you get this cool figured pattern, typically they would take two adjacent pieces and do what they call book matching, where they would put adjacent slices and fold it open like a book so it'd be symmetrical down the middle. We don't have that here. This is a pretty basic cabinet. Underneath this would be plywood. You know, I'd be thinking, well, that's a bad thing, that's a cheap thing. Well, like fancier cabinets, maybe they use solid wood. Not really, because it's not stable. That's why generally in woodworking, be it like a house or furniture, you don't have a slab of wood that's 2 feet wide. It's made out of 4 inch or so pieces that are glued together. Because you get large pieces of wood, they start bowing and splitting and getting uneven. Plywood, they orient each layer in a different direction with the grain and then glue them together, and under high pressure makes a really stable, flat, strong piece of wood. That's a good thing. It's not a cheap thing. And then on this, I think they call it kerfing, where they took the plywood, you'll see when I take the back off, and they cut notches in it so they can bend it. They didn't steam it and bend it. They cut a bunch of notches in the plywood so they could curve it over. And then when you use veneer, it's real easy to just, because it's so thin, to wrap it around the sides. All right, so we've got a combination of hardwood and veneer. So our goal is to bring the finish back. So the first thing you have to do is figure out, well, what was the original finish? If it's gone, you might have to do a little bit of detective work, try to find photos of or examples of the original finish. In this case, we have enough of it here, and I've worked on enough cabinets from this era to know it's brown mahogany. You might think of mahogany as being red. Well, base mahogany, raw mahogany wood, it's not that strong a color. It's not bright red, it's not bright brown red. It's sort of brown, slightly red. I'll try to dig up some raw veneer if I have some around here. So that's one of the reasons I put color on it, is to make it pop even more. And brown mahogany, it's a classic color. We're going to be using products made by Mohawk, and they have a line of toners called Ultra Classic. And that's right. They're the same colors they've been making for like 100 years. And we're going to be using Ultra Classic brown mahogany toner lacquer. It's going to be exactly the same color as this. Given, figured as it's aged a little bit, the color has changed slightly. But again, I've seen enough of these, especially when you get into TVs. Geez, probably 2/3 of mahogany, 1/3 are walnut, and it's always brown mahogany or medium brown walnut. That's like 95% of the cabinets you're going to find. So it makes their job a little bit easier. Okay, so next thing we're going to want to do, now that we've identified what it's made out of, what type of finish it is, and what we want to put on it, we need to break this down and get the old finish off. Now let me step back a little bit, jumping ahead of the game. So I said now that we've identified what type of finish it is, you might be wondering, well, how do I know? What are the types of finishes might there be out there? Again, I'm telling you, if it was made 30s, 40s, 50s, it was lacquer. Some guys I've seen use shellac or tung oil. They didn't use that stuff back then. Yeah, it existed. Shellac, French polishing. Yeah, maybe if it was made in 1900, 1910. This stuff, lacquer. I guarantee you it's lacquer. If you weren't sure and you really wanted to know, there are tests. For example, shellac dissolves in grain alcohol, denatured alcohol. Lacquer does not. So if you put a little bit on, say, a Q-tip and rubbed it on there, if the finish started getting gummy and dissolving, it would be shellac. Likewise, lacquer dissolves with lacquer thinner, which is primarily acetone. So again, you can put a little Q-tip on there and go on. However, acetone / lacquer thinner also dissolves shellac. So that's why you want to start with the weakest solvent and work your way up to determine what it is. Polyurethane, aka varnish, did it exist? Kind of started to come around in the 50s, 60s. They didn't use it on this stuff. Part of it is the drying time. Lacquer dries, man, if a good temperature humidity, it like dries almost as soon as you spray it on. Oil-based polyurethane takes a long time, a day or two to fully cure up. So when I say some of these processes take a long time, not lacquer. That's one of the greatest things about it. However, it's not as simple as just spraying lacquer onto raw wood. As you see, we're going to go through a few steps to prep the surface, seal it, prepare it for the final finish. Alright, before we get to that, we want to get all this old crud off of it. Before we do that, we need to take everything out. Ideally, whatever you're working on, you can completely break it. So now, we of course want to get the chassis out, we want to take the back off, we want to take all this front grill off, including the logo, everything. We just want the wood cabinet, the grill cloth, the glass bezel. Everything has got to go. Because imagine if you're stripping this and spraying this on, you don't, of course, don't want to get any of the grill cloth. And having to mask this stuff off, that's just a colossal pain. So, just get in there, try to figure it out. Break it down, get your screwdriver, get a flashlight out, figure out how to take all this stuff out. So this cabinet luckily doesn't need any repair, so we can dive right into the next step, which is to remove the old finish. There are plenty of commercial strippers on the market. One I've used a bunch in the past is Citrus stripping gel. You can get methyl ethyl chloride and all sorts of nasty stuff. I don't use them anymore. And I'll tell you, not on cabinets like this. I'll tell you why. They're overkill and they're messy. You got a lot of gooey residue to deal with, and then you have to get the remains of the stripper off and out of the wood and out of the grain and all that. Especially this stuff. It's orange, it's gooey, it gets all over the place. These old finishes often fall off so easily. I did one recently. I just used masking tape, put it on and pulled it off, and it pulled all the finish off. You can see how deteriorated this is. A bunch of the finish is already gone. So I recommend two techniques to you. One is scraping, which I've been using more and more and more. And it's handy that I have this blade because this is often all that I use. Yeah, you can get commercial scrapers, card scrapers, for sure. But for some of these smaller cabinets where they're curved and stuff, I often find that this is really convenient. You just take it and you just do this. And you see that old finish is just coming right off. And whatever that can't get off, or if that's too much of a headache, just use lacquer thinner or acetone. Soak it in a rag. Spread it on there with a brush. Let it sit for a little while. It takes a little while to soften this up and loosen it up, but once you do, it just starts wiping right off. Yeah, now there will be fumes if you do this outside. Do this in a garage. Do it with an exhaust hood if at all possible. I'm not going to sugarcoat that. Yeah, it's going to stink, and it's just not the healthiest thing to breathe in, but it will for sure get all the traces off. So I'm going to proceed to scrape as much of this as I can. And we'll use a lacquer thinner. I don't think it's going to take too long. So I'll try to give you a better look at the process. Often I find it's easier to pull towards myself rather than push away. And sometimes I curve it a little bit so it bites in a little more. Also helps if there's an area where it's already gone to start there. Right, because if you just like try to go right to an area where there's solid finish and go right in the middle, it may be a little hard to get started. But no, in this case, look at that. It's just coming right off. I will warn you though, you should use some eye protection because these little flakes of finish, especially if you're pulling towards yourself, will go all over the place. Look at that. Piece of cake. Other big benefit of doing this is the surface you're left with is perfectly smooth. No need to sand. That's something you're going to hear me talk about a lot, is I try not to sand at all if possible. This is not a new construction. This is a finely finished piece of woodworking. It's already been sanded and finished and all that. It's already smooth. We don't want to sand through the veneer. Plus it's time consuming and it's tedious. And we just don't need to. If we scrape this, any little high spots or bumps or defects are going to get scraped off. And then we rub it down with lacquer thinner after this. It's just going to be preparing a perfectly smooth, nice, clean surface. So we shouldn't do any sanding at all. And if any of you ever watched on PBS Woodwright Shop, who was on for many, many years with Roy Underhill, and I saw he had a guest come in on one show, and he was refinishing something, restoring something from like the 1700s. It had veneer and shellac and all that, and he was scraped everything, scraped the shellac, whatever. There's all the stages. He was just using scrapers. I don't even know if they had sandpaper back then, and he got a perfect finish out of it. And after all, it makes sense. I mean, we have a nice, sharp, smooth, flat surface. Yeah, I mean, it's fantastic. Now that I've scraped it off, I'm getting into a stage that I really enjoy doing because you get to see what, sort of a preview of what the finished product is going to look like, and that's putting lacquer thinner on it, because since it hits the wood, it makes it look really nice. Notice we're getting color. That's the remains of the color. Now, I've seen arguments about whether or not they used stain back then. I'm not saying they didn't, but there most definitely is some color in the finish. And absolutely, on the solid wood areas, there's color in the finish. Did they use stain in addition to the toner? I don't know. But we're going to be using toner lacquer, that's for sure. Now, there's something else to this, especially if you're using commercial stripper or the lacquer thinner, is there's something called grain filler in here. If you look really close at a wood like mahogany, there's a lot of pores in the wood. It's a fine hardwood, but it has a lot of pores. All these little darker areas, those are depressions in the wood. If you look at it at an angle, you can see it, especially if you're just running your fingernail over it. That's a rough surface. If you just go to your hardware store, grab a can of wipe-on stain, and then some spray poly or wipe-on poly or tung oil or polyacrylic. Be my guest. It'll look fine. It's not what they did back then. Back then they used something called grain filler to fill in all those pores. It's I often say it's like tile grout, or like really fine wood filler. It's like thick oil-based paint. It's an oil-based, well, at least the kind I use. It's an oil-based binding agent with a really, really fine filler. I believe it's silica, very similar, maybe the same as the stuff that's in sandpaper, with a color added. And the idea is you wipe it all in, work it into all the grain, and wipe off the excess, and it goes into all those deep spots, and makes them darker. Which some people don't like, because it makes the overall thing a little bit darker, muddy looking. If you do it right, it makes the wood look better. because it adds more definition. It makes the grain pop more. But it also makes it perfectly smooth, a piano finish, they call it. So that's what we're going to be doing. That's getting ahead of the game, though. First, we got to get the remaining finish off. But this is what you're left with after you strip it. And this is a bit darker than what raw mahogany would look like, because there is still some residual color. You can see as I'm wiping off the lacquer thinner, there is still quite a bit of color in there. That's okay, as long as it's even, that's fine. Now, another technique you might find useful is to combine. Now, you might find it useful to combine both techniques. Put on some lacquer thinner, especially if it's more stubborn and the scraping isn't working. Put on some lacquer thinner to soften it up, and then scrape. I'm moving on to one of the sides now and found something kind of interesting. It is an old repair. It's not even the right kind of wood, the right kind of mahogany. The grain is totally different. It's raised up a little bit. But you know what? I'm going to leave it. Yeah, I do have both new mahogany veneer and some I salvaged from old cabinets. I could pry this off, cut a patch, and match the grain better, but you know what? This is part of the history of it. It's there, it's done, it's glued down securely. I'm just going to leave it. We're going to refinish it along with the rest of it. You encounter something like this, leave it up to you. Now, if you do have a section of veneer that is missing, a few suggestions. One, you could just leave it, and if you cut, the underlying wood's going to be much lighter, typically. You could stain it so it wouldn't be as noticeable. You can get veneer. If it's a mahogany quarter cut like this, you can get new veneer that's darn near identical. Here we go. This is a piece of modern, new, raw mahogany veneer. That's what it looks like when you order it. So it's light reddish brown. Obviously it doesn't look anywhere near like this color. You can see how much color gets added to it. So, if I wanted to patch this, one thing, having, well, at least I angled it. That's not so bad. I see a lot of times where people cut out a rectangle that put in the patch. That horizontal line stands out like a sore thumb. Ideally, it's irregular. And what I suggest you would do is take a blade or some type of tool and put an angle so that your old veneer starts high and then goes low. Taper it down. Then take your new veneer, cut it larger than you need, glue it, and then clamp the snot out of it. So you've got that ramp going up. And then sand this level. And it should taper and feather from the new into the old. So you can imagine if I did that with this piece, I could probably make it darn near invisible if I wanted to. If it was missing, I would, but I kind of like this old repair attempt. I want to leave it. I want to leave it. But if you want to replace it, that's my advice to you, is prepare the old damage. Try to leave it irregular if you can on the horizontal plane. This actually, it's better to go vertical because the grain's running this way. And do this and glue, clamp solidly, and then trim off the excess afterwards. Sand it. It should be pretty much invisible. The color difference obviously will be there, but with the grain filler and the toner lacquer, you should be able to blend in the colors, maybe rub a little stain into it. Alrighty, finished stripping the cabinet. It took me about an hour and a half. So it looks pretty miserable now, right? Well, I'll take care of that soon enough. Now, tell you what, changed my mind about this. The rest of the cabinet looks so nice. I am going to try to fix that. if I can pop off this old patch, and I will go through, and I also wanted to demonstrate that technique to you guys. So grab a blade and let's see if we can pop this off. I may want to use some heat to loosen the glue. At least it's starting to come off pretty easily. My one concern is that the veneer I have might be thinner than the old stuff, which is just a drag to deal with. You can double it up and try to sand it down, or put some filler between to make up the difference. It's just a hassle to have to deal with. At least this looks like they kind of used like 3 pieces of wood in total, and this outer piece is coming off easily enough. Pieces further in, not so much. Alright, got the old patch out. A heat gun did definitely help to loosen up whatever type of glue they used. And then I took a razor blade and feathered the edge here and here. Now I have to cut a patch and hope the thickness is equivalent to this and lines up. Alright, tell you what, rather than using new veneer, I have a section of old veneer I salvaged from a Motorola 12K1, I think it was. And we're going to cut out a section that fits in there, and I'll leave the old finish on it until it is set up. I'm going to cut this piece out right here, and again, like I said, leave it. I'm going to cut it bigger than it needs to be, squirt some tight bond glue under here, and clamp and clamp and clamp. It's super tough. And it's so easy to do right here because we have good support behind it, so it's really, really easy to clamp in this area. So, let's see how that works out. Can't be worse than the old repair. Alrighty, here is my patch. Got some tight bond number 1. If I had been planning on this better, I would have done this before I stripped it. But, oh well. So yeah, it's definitely oversized. There we go. I'll wipe off the excess with a damp rag in a moment. And then we are going to clamp, 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 and after the glue sets up, we're going to scrape, sand, whatever we have to do to level that all out. And, well, hopefully it will be virtually invisible. Now, I ended up doing things a little bit out of order because I didn't know I was going to be making a repair. Again, I recommend you do any of your patches, your gluing and all that before you strip down the cabinet. At any rate, my patch is now solidly set up, and I'm working at removing the excess. So, because I've cut the patch bigger than the damaged area, it's high around the edge here where I need to remove it. I've started to. What I've been doing is scraping it. So all this area where you see this raw wood, that's the excess. That's what I'm working down. And right here, you can start to see the original finish, or the old wood is starting to emerge. It's just about level right here. So that's what the finished seam is going to look like. Now it still has finish on it. Once I strip this little bit and get the grain filler, it'll blend in much, much better. But the goal right now is to, remember, I had this beveled down and then I got this coming up. So we want to get this all perfectly level. I'm just using my, again, just straight edge, to remove the bulk of it, and when it gets really close to being level, I will break out the sandpaper, 220 grit, if I need to. Honestly, I could probably scrape it all the way too. But that is the trick to making an invisible or nearly invisible patch. One, don't have it super geometric where it's, you know, a rectangle. Try to make it a little bit irregular and bevel this down. And it doesn't hurt to take your other piece and maybe back sand it a little bit to get that, having a corresponding bevel going the other way. And then clamp it very hard to mash it in around those edges, and then wear away the excess. It's a little tedious, but that is the best way I know of to blend it in, make it darn near invisible. And there we go, just finished with scraping, a little bit of light sanding with 220 grit, wipe it down with a little lacquer thinner, give you guys a better idea what it'll look like with some finish on it. Is it 100% perfect? No, but I think it's pretty darn good. Certainly a lot better than what was there. The color match is excellent. The thickness of the veneer is the same. The grain is pretty close to being the same. Once we put on grain filler and the toner lacquer and all that, it'll be darn near invisible.